Now, Steve Merrill has a lot of passion about history, extremely knowledgeable. If you don't know him yet, you're going to feel like he's your best friend after this presentation. We love him. He's done so many great things for the museum. And this is a fascinating subject, and I just can't wait to learn more about it. So Steve Merrill, thank you so much for helping us out, and take it away, sir.
Okay, if I click on that button and this button, that should work. There we go. Can you all see that, I hope? Say yes or shake your head. Yeah, okay, good. Boy, I've seen some people on there I haven't talked to in a while. Tom Blandon from Texas, and I think my sister-in-law, Sharon Allison. I think my son Steven's on there, Dallas and Marna from Chicago. So it's really exciting. But today I want to talk to you about Evans and Sontag, famous outlaws of California. Now, we're not going to focus on Evans and Sontag for the rest of the calendar year. We're also going to, hopefully in the future, talk about Black Bart, the gentleman bandit, the Daltons in Wonder Valley, seriously? And Joaquin Murrieta and Three Finger Jack. But we're going to start out talking about John Sontag and his partner in crime, Chris Evans. They were responsible for perhaps a dozen deaths, 7 armed robberies, and you can't sugarcoat their deeds, even though you'll see that they tried to do so. Now, I know that this audience undoubtedly contains some folks that would like to hear about bad girls of the Sierra, but no, maybe next year. Okay, let's move on. And why talk about these guys from the 1880s and 1890s? And I'll tell you why. I'm glad you asked. Train robberies were a really big deal in the 1880s and the 1890s. And frankly, they still are today. For example, look at that bottom point. In the current edition of Tourist Train Guidebook, there are across the nation 52 steam trains that you can ride. 12 proudly proclaim that there will be a train robbery during your ride. So train robberies are they just got to be. Now, this is what blew me away. The very first movie created by Thomas Edison in 1903, which told one continuous story, a 13-minute thriller, was a huge success as people marveled at it in the theaters. You can see in the poster in the upper left-hand corner, the poster about the Edison film, The Great Train Robbery. And that set the stage for Hollywood's obsession with Western movies and TV shows for the next 60 years. Look in the upper right-hand corner. You can thank Chris Evans and John Sontag for how you grew up in front of your black and white TV with your cowboy hats, vests, and 6-shooters. I don't think I'm the only one that grew up that way, but I did grow up that way. And you know, we'd sit there, maybe not a cowboy hat, maybe a Davy Crockett coonskin cap, but we just couldn't miss it on our little tiny black and white TV. In addition, here's another reason why we should bother with this story. As you all know, Ezra Meeker was one of the 400,000 people who immigrated across the Oregon Trail in the 1840s, 1850s, and so on. Now, he was born in 1830, went across the trail in 1850, lived until 1927. So when he died, my dad was 12 years old. My mom was 2. They weren't together at the time. But it doesn't seem like it's that far removed because of that overlap of ages. And he said, as reverence, oh, by the way, Ezra Meeker also went back and forth across the Oregon Trail several times in wagons and raised money from local citizenry to create monuments saying the Oregon Trail went here. Look out for your next Starbucks stop. And he went on to say, as reverence for the past dies out in the breasts of a generation, so likewise patriotism wanes. In the measure that the love of history of the past dies, so likewise do the higher aspirations for the future. Keep the flower of patriotism alive. To do that, we must keep the memory of the past vividly in mind. Now, Chris and John, where are they now? Well, hello, they're dead. Chris Evans, and we'll talk more about some of these details. He didn't die until 1917. Again, my dad was just 2. So the old man of my dad's era, when he was really, really young, Civil War veterans, Oregon Trail veterans, just so much overlap. And then on the right, you see John Sontag, and Chris Evans is buried in Oregon. John Sontag is buried in Fresno. You can see the dates on his tombstone are July 3rd, 1892. Now, if you're a stickler and you look at my script, you'll see John Sontag died in 1893. He, in fact, did die in 1893. And here's a little tidbit of information. When they made the original wooden grave marker, they got it wrong, posted as 1892. So when his fancy schmancy cement or granite one was replacing the wooden one, in order to be fair to the folks who had made the first one, they kept the same wrong information on there. I think it's kind of funny. But they've been gone a long time. But again, you've got this whole idea of lives and times overlapping. So what got all this train robbery stuff started? Well, a lot of it, it is said, goes back to the Mussel Slough incident of May 11th, 1880. Oh, look what I got here. See my little handy dandy chunk of rock? This little handy dandy chunk of rock came from that rock monument you see sitting there by my Harley. As I went down to look at the monument, and we'll talk about what it's about in a minute, and the metal plaque was gone, and I thought, doggone metal thieves. So I called the police, and they go, no, we're refurbishing it. I don't know if Kings County has fixed it yet or not. But at any rate, the Mussel Slough incident came about because the Southern Pacific, everybody hated the Southern Pacific for reasons that we will explain in a minute, promised settlers, not in a contract, to sell land to them for about $2.50 an acre. That's right, $2.50 an acre, without regard to improvements. They did that to attract people to come and settle the area here in the valley. And when they settlers would come, they would be able to, have railroad business and all that sort of a thing. So when the farms were improved and the railroad came to collect, they appraised the land at an improved price of about $35 an acre. And now, a lot of the original settlers couldn't pay, so the railroad evicted them and sold them to new settlers who could pay. That plus price gouging and rate structures drove many people off the land. So some of the settlers at a picnic on May the 11th, talking this all over, very, very angry and upset, said, well, we're going to go and fix it. So they got their guns and went and confronted some of the Southern Pacific officials who were evicting people and a lawman, and a gun battle ensued. And mostly the ones who suffered were the settlers. Bodies were laid there at the Tragedy Oak Tree, which continued to stand until the 1990s. That's how the memorial stone is supposed to look, but here's how it looked the last time I saw it. So I don't know if they indeed have fixed it or not. But let's talk about, let's go back a bit and talk about about Chris Evans for just a minute. He was from someplace in Ontario, Canada. So one of them, they're violent Canadians. Bell's Corner near Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. He's known to be brutal, hair-triggered, and quick to act violently. His buddy in crime, John Sontag, they got connected because John, we'll see in a minute, was injured in a train accident. He worked for the Southern Pacific, and he couldn't get work, but Chris Evans, who met him in a warehouse where Chris was working, took pity on him, said, come live on my ranch, my farm, and you can work for me, and we'll have a good time working together. Well, now, this is what brings us to John Sontag's story, and this is what kind of caused the whole thing to really get rolling. John Sontag had gotten a job with the Southern Pacific. Even though he was quite a bit younger than Chris, the men hit it off as friends. He was also working for the Southern Pacific and as a brakeman, and one day there was some kind of a mishap. He fell off the train as it was moving slowly under the wheels, and the wheels came to a stop just very close to his chest. He was raised in a strict Catholic home, but I don't think that had a whole lot to do with many of the years of his life. But he said about his problems with the Southern Pacific, there was no trouble getting a position with the Southern Pacific as a brakeman. I had secured a good run when, a few months after my initiation into this new line of work, I was thrown from a car, falling under the wheels. The train stopped slowly, and immediately the wheels almost ran right up to my body. And had they moved another 6 inches, I would have been instantly killed, for, as he put it, the big grinders would have crushed out my heart. As it was, I was badly injured. The yard master sent me to the company's hospital in Sacramento, recovered somewhat. And then he went to see the superintendent who had promised him a job. But when he came to find a new job that he could do while still recovering, he was told that the Southern Pacific did not hire cripples. So John made it clear to Chris that he had one idea in mind, and that was to get even with the Southern Pacific. Everybody hated the SP anyway because of the rate gouging and the Mussel Slough incident, etc. So these two guys together were like mixing nitro and glycerin. Now you might think, well, why didn't they help them? Because the company's view of things was everybody knew their job had risks, and if you got hurt on the job, wasn't our fault. There had to have been some degree of negligence that got you hurt, or maybe somebody else was negligent, and you guys are all fellow servants, and it's therefore not the company's fault. Say it with me, not the company's fault. So John and Chris started plotting what they could do. Now, interestingly, when they started doing their train robberies, they never robbed the passengers. They only went after the strong boxes from Wells Fargo and the Southern Pacific stuff. They didn't hurt any of the passengers, well, except the ones that got in the way of the gunfights. But just real briefly, here's 4 important locations in the story of Evans and Sontag. There was their old Visalia homestead. We'll see in a minute. You can still find that location. There was the Redwood Ranch up in the Sierra, and I've been there. There was the Big Sampson Mine, Stokes Mountain, and the Stone Corral. So all of these places played very important roles in the story of Evans and Sontag. Now, here's where the Evans dwelling was, here right there in the lower left, right on the corner of Northwest 2nd Avenue and Strawberry Street. Those streets still exist, and there's how it looks today. So the streets are still there, but the buildings, of course, are not. The second important location was the Redwood Ranch. Now, the Redwood Ranch was up in the area, if you look real closely and you can read those squiggly maps, by Eshom Valley. So I drove up there, put my dog in the car and drove on up to the Eshom Valley and started looking around, following the pictures and all this sort of thing. And that cabin, which Chris and his twin brother Tom built in 1875, is no longer there, of course. It's been replaced by Starbucks. Not really. But at any rate, that picture, which was taken in May of 1936, with Eva Evans sitting on the front, picture taken in 1933. But forestry people took over the cabin, used it as a ranger station, and that's Eva. You're going to hear a lot about Eva in just a few minutes. You can't understand the story of Evans and Sontag without finding out a lot about Eva, and you're just going to crack up. So anyway, I went up there, and here's what I found. Now, those are not the same buildings, obviously. After the Redwood Ranch properties, which were being used by the Forest Service as ranger cabins, were rebuilt, and they had these nice, at the time, newer buildings, but those are now abandoned also. But you can clomp around in there and look at it and go, wow, that what a crazy place this was. So that's the second important place. And then Chris Evans had a gold mine at Sampson Flat. Sampson Flat mine is about 1 mile west of Sampson Flat. And I tried to go there, but I went to the ranger station there at, what's the name of that valley you pass while you're going up 180? Said, how do I get to Sampson Flat? And they said, well, the road is washed out. You can't get there. But that was back several years ago during the time when we used to get a lot of rain. So maybe I can get there now. But Chris Evans could walk from his Visalia property to Big Sampson Mine, about 45 miles in a day. The guy had an incredible capacity for physical fitness, and he would go back and forth and up and down all through the mountains. Just an amazing physical specimen, as they say. So those are the locations, but let's let the games begin. As I said, they did several train robberies. Why? To get even with the Southern Pacific. February the 22nd, 1889, in the town of Pixley, 2 people were killed, and they got away with $600. Then, not long after, January the 20th, 1890, in Goshen, 1 more person was killed, probably a train employee, and they got away with at least $500. So, pressing their luck, they robbed another train in Alila, which we call Early Mart. 1 more person got killed in that train robbery, and they didn't get anything. And then in Ceres, further north, another train robbery attempt, didn't get anything. Now, in the middle of that time, up by Ceres, which is around Modesto, correct? Chris and his family worked a livery stable, some horses and all that sort of a thing. Well, everything he touched did not turn to gold. It all turned to dust and ashes. His livery stable in Modesto burned down. Horses died and all kinds of terrible stuff. So they went back to what they were good at, robbing trains. Racine, Wisconsin. Chris Sontag's brother, George, was involved in that one. And they got $4,800 to $9,800. And some of you who are good with figuring out how much that equals today, maybe you can put that in some of the notes. And then they went to Kasota, Illinois, and got nothing. And then they came back to the beautiful town of Collis. And as you can see from the little map there, Collis is what we now call Kerman. And they robbed a train, and they got about $2,000 plus Peruvian silver dollars that had been minted, I think, in San Francisco, and were taking the train back to Peru. So they got these Peruvian silver dollars, couldn't do a thing with them. So they buried them in Chris Evans' yard. Great idea. Well, the detectives who thought that Chris Evans and John Sontag were responsible for these various train robberies without technicalities like search warrants, started digging holes on Chris Evans' property, and one of them came up with a Peruvian Saint silver dollar. Well, that proved it. So there was a gunfight at Chris Evans' property. Now, this particular picture is a different gunfight, but it kind of went the same way. They had several of the law enforcement people were hit, and Chris Evans and John Sontag got away. Who shot first? Eva, his daughter, said that Will Smith fired recklessly into the house. Not our Will Smith of our day. Had it been this Will Smith, it only had slap fights instead of gunfights. You know what I mean? But anyway, they started shooting and everybody's shooting back and forth. These guys got away, running out of town on a wagon. It's just like mind-boggling. Will Smith is injured. George Whitty denied that they shot, and they both ran from the home. Well, then this 10-month on the run phase of their life begins. Now, one of the events in that posse hunt, that hunt by posses in that time, was something that is depicted in this picture here. And it took place at a place called Young's Cabin. And I don't know where it is, but it's up in the Sierra and it's probably not there anymore. Well, anyway, so these posse guys are walking toward this cabin, assuming that they can get some food and water and rest and everything. Lo and behold, Evans and Sontag are in there. And they came out guns a-blazing. More people get shot, and the law enforcement people did not do well in any of those settings. So highlights of 10 months on the run. From August of 92 to July of 93, Evans and Sontag hit out in the central Sierra, Eshom Valley, Badger Flat, Sampson Flat, way up there under big giant rocks that they called Fort Defiance and all that sort of thing. And here's where it gets really mind-boggling. Why could they just run off to the mountains and do fine? Well, they had friends. And guess where the friends were from? For the most part, Tennessee. And they were Southern sympathizers. And they hated big business, which they saw as Northern power. The antipathy of the Civil War had not died out by that time. It's safe to say some things don't change. The shootout at Young's Cabin left 2 more law enforcement personnel, but finally they were brought down at a place just north of Visalia called the Stone Corral. Here on the left, you can see a Google Earth picture of Stokes Mountain. The posse got wind. They were coming down. This is what they would do, coming down to see their family. And Chris would walk down, visit his family, and then walk back up after a few days. Well, they got wind he was coming down, so they hid out at a cabin near the Stone Corral. It was a stone pigsty that had been built in 1853, and it's still there today. And it's another Google Earth picture, and you can see it. And if you know the right people, you can go there. So the gunfight erupted when they saw Evans and Sontag coming down the trail. And this time, only one law enforcement person was injured. But John Sontag, he didn't fare well at all. Oh, I'll come back to them in just a second. Here is the memorial marker there in Visalia by the Stone Corral. Anybody recognize that young lady standing there? That's right. It's our own Lisa Monterio, who was the executive director for the museum for several years. She knows somebody who said, you can come on the land to take your pictures there. And so I found that on the internet and was like, I know who that is. Anyway, as you can see, that's John. He did not do well. He was shot several times, but because it had been a pig's pen and he fell into a 2-foot-high pile of pig poop, they had to prop him up on something to prove that they had got him. So they propped him up, stood around, and took his picture. Well, Chris Evans also was shot. Here again, the guy was incredible. He got away. They tracked his blood track, but they couldn't catch him. He got to another cabin where he thought he would find a sympathetic family, but one of them betrayed him and contacted law enforcement. Because of all his getting shot up, he lost the use of his right arm and one of his eyes. You might say it was a bad day at Black Rock. So John Sontag was taken by buggy and to the Fresno jail where he passed away. The Chris Evans' actual 6-shooter is in the possession of the Tulare Museum. And here's some other favorite weapons of that era and those people: the Winchester lever-action rifle and ubiquitous double-barrel shotgun. And again, it was a pretty brutal time. Now, there had been a $10,000 reward for their capture And as you can see, if you look at the details on this screen, some people got some and some didn't get very much. And it was finally settled in a court in Los Angeles. Two of them on the back platform of the train going back to Fresno got into a fist fight and fell off the back of the train. But they survived and lived long enough to be able to enjoy their reward money. A whole bunch of them didn't. Now, this is where it takes another ironic turn. Big business in the form of William Randolph Hearst and the San Francisco Examiner supported Evans and Sontag because they, like the newspaper, opposed big business in the form of Southern Pacific. Now, of course, the San Francisco newspaper was big business. You know, you don't build castles unless you're making lots of money off of somebody. And the reason that the newspaper and people like Mr. William Randolph Hearst hated the newspaper was because at that time, California was controlled by the octopus. Now, if you've studied any kind of California history at all, you'll know that back in that time, the so-called Gilded Age, Charles Crocker and Collis P. Huntington controlled the governor, the courts, the Democratic parties, the Republican parties. These were two of the four guys, along with Stanford and one of the other guys, who were the so-called Big Four that built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad. So they made a lot of money. And then they got control of so many things. And it's fair to say, back then, as now, they had the best politicians that money could buy. So I like this little poem. Joaquin Miller, who is known as the poet of the Sierra, he said this about all of the various characters involved in this whole thing. In men whom men condemn as ill, I find so much of goodness still. In men whom men pronounce as divine, I find so much of sin and blot. I dare not draw a line between the two where God has not. And we will see in just a couple of minutes that one of the really wonderful people in this whole thing was Chris Evans' daughter, Eva. Now, here's some of the impact. Lawmen's families were deprived of the menfolk, just on and on. Eva attempted suicide in 1897. She saved enough pain pills so she could open the door, which was a euphemism in those days for taking her own life. In her unpublished memoirs, and the museum has a copy of these unpublished memoirs, she wrote, "Mom found me in a coma, shook me into consciousness, and I told her what I had done. She gave me mustard and warm water and sent for Dr. Page." Yeah, I didn't know that mustard and warm water could do that much. You can see the damage that these guys' lives of crime had. Now, you can't tell their story, as I have said, without meeting Eva Evans, the daughter of Chris Evans and his wife, Molly Bird. She was known as Mrs. Albert Cribbs, Mrs. Perry McCullough, Mrs. Andrew Kinkella. She, to raise money for her father's legal defense, along with a fellow named R.C. White, who was an up-and-coming playwright of that time, they wrote a stage play of Evans and Sontag, the Outlaws of Visalia. And he persuaded Eva and his wife, Molly Bird, to play themselves in this play. Now, the play was enacted up and down California, and they used the money for Chris's defense. He, at one point, while the play was still going on, escaped from the jail in Fresno. Somebody snuck a pistol into him, probably in his dinner platter. He got out of jail, shot a city official. They hijacked a buggy and took off out of town, but they were caught. So then they did that. They just wrote another chapter into the play. Now, the play was scandalous by late 19th century standards. The play depicted actually, I mean, they actually had horses on stage. And some of the highlights are there, as you can see. And here's one of the things that, whoa, I don't want that one. I missed one. Hold on, go back. Oh no, this is the one right here. Yeah, okay. Eva was actually on stage in trousers, astride a horse. Scandal, scandal, scandal. And here's what some of the newspapers wrote about that. It's absolutely hysterical. To go to this page, and this page. Oh yeah, while the play was still going on up and down California, Eva let it known that she was going to be married. And then the newspaper says, news of her marriage had potential to be worse press than no press. The Fresno expositor predicted it would hurt the play, explaining that in spite of all sentiment and fact, there was much sympathy for Eva, struggling to make money to defend her father. It was the considering of her in that light that brought most of the success. She was essentially social media wizard of her day, because there was newspapers and there were stage plays, and that was it. That romance has largely been brushed away now, and the best part of the play has lost its spirit because Eva is getting married. Another reporter who admittedly was thrilled, here's where it gets really creepy, at the sight of seeing the beautiful maiden with the bloom of virginal innocence, clad in trousers and astride a horse. Now best betrayed to learn she was even married, and that the bloom was must, and that my sweet thought was a misfit. Doesn't she know that no man would warp his eye and impair his eyesight just to see a married woman's trousers on both sides of a horse? Wow. That was then, and this is now. Okay, so here's some of the aftermath you can read real quickly. Will Smith, the fellow who'd run away from the first shooting, died of a stroke in 1896. George Whitty, also involved in the fugitive hunt, tried to become a county sheriff, committed suicide in 1901 over an unrequited love affair. A couple of the guys were tied in with the OK Corral. It's just like, what? How did this happen? It's all these things were tied together. And real quickly, I'm not going to read this stuff to you because you'd all hang up. But if you want to read more, there's some incredible books and magazines out there. This Hugh Maxwell, this is one of the best ones. Train Robbers and Tragedies, written in 2003. Robbers of the Rails, Sontag Boys of Minnesota. And this, if you really want to dig into it a little further, this is the one to get. Train Robber's Daughter. You can get that probably on eBay for $6 or $7. And The Prodigal Sons, Wild Tulare County by Terry Ullman. He's the guy I think we should get for some of these. Historic Atlas of the Old West. Even some important famous magazines wrote up about him. True Frontier in May of 1970, Smithsonian Magazine in 1995, True West in April of 1909. And finally, in a manuscript, unpublished, but in the possession of the Huntington Library, manuscript entitled An Outlaw and His Family, Memoirs by Eva Evans, said, yeah, that's how we got our money. To the end of his life, Chris Evans denied being a train robber. He said, I only killed in self-defense. But he was sentenced to life in prison, and after 17 years, he got out of jail because he was a model prisoner, banished from California, and lived out the rest of his life in Oregon. Now, so really, this is the end. It was the end of the Old West, because not too long after that, they started chasing criminals in cars, not on horses and buggies. Or is it the end? Is it just me, or do I the big corporations still take advantage of little guys unless forced by law to treat them fairly. Oh, that never happens today. Oh, and could it be true that if you're big enough, you can operate above the law and no one will challenge you? Well, what we know is that if you do try to overcome injustice all on your own, you will pay, because here are some wrongs that will never be redressed in this life. Some things just need to wait to the day of God's judgment. For example, John Sontag, remember I mentioned he was raised in a strict Catholic home. On his deathbed, was comforted by a Catholic priest. And so there you have the story of Evans and Sontag, and how some of those things are still going on today. Thank you very much. You've been a very kind audience. And let's take some time for questions.
Yeah, Steve, great job. Just very engaging and a lot of great local information there. Just for those watching, about $5,000 in 1891 was $155,000 today. So
wow.
So it's buy about 5 or 6 tanks of gas, I think. But but it just gives a frame of reference. That was the Racine, Wisconsin robbery. Why did they go to Racine, Wisconsin? I mean, it's kind of a non sequitur. Hey, we're hanging out in Visalia. Let's go to Racine and have the best success we've ever had robbing a train.
Well, there is so many details to all of these train robberies. It's just mind-boggling. But they went there because that's where Brother George was. And he encouraged them to come back and rob trains back there. And they were able to do it. You know, they pulled it, stopped the train a mile away from the stop and rob the train and disable the train if possible and take off. So it was because of family connections that they robbed trains back there.
And about 3 or 4 people died. Were they? Did they die because they wouldn't give up the money, or they died because they said, "I'm not going to open this safe," and they had to shoot them, or was it an actual shootout, or do we know anything about the people that died?
Well, yeah, again, every one of those stories has so many details. You could make a presentation on any one of them. Some cases it was the guard inside of the car who wouldn't open it, and so they just kept shooting until one of them got shot. And if you watch the movie that Thomas Edison created, you can see they break into the car and they shoot him, and then they blow things up with dynamite, and that was all based on fact. That's what actually happened in those days. But some were resisting. Other people, unfortunately, hey, what's going on? I'm getting off the train to look and see why we stop. Bam, he's got shot. So it's just crazy, crazy, crazy.
And we have a couple other questions here. Why did law enforcement not fare well in gunfights? Were they outnumbered or outgunned? Underpowered?
Chris was a crack shot. He just could shoot him. Like even when they were at the Stone Corral and John Sontag had been shot up pretty bad and Chris had been wounded, he was still able to shoot one of the law enforcement people in the leg as he passed between a buggy and the cabin where they were hiding. He was just a crack shot.
And a good question here from Michelle. Are any of these sites accessible? It'd be a great way to have a hike or horseback ride to these locations. Are they all on private land? It would be kind of a fun, maybe museum event to put together. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the Stone Corral Monument, Lisa Montario, who used to work in the museum, has a relative who works for one of those big orange packing places who knows somebody that owns the property that has the Stone Corral on it. So she was able to ask them, can we go? Now, if they were going to do a big event, a fundraiser, et cetera, maybe she could get them to open up the gates for them. The Eshom Valley location, the Redwood Ranch, it's just a lot of trees and stickers, but the broken down buildings that were a replacement of the original cabin that Chris built, those broken down buildings are still there. And you can drive right up to those basically.
Great.
And in Sampson Valleys or Sampson Flat gold mine, if they've repaired the road, you could drive into that.
You know, when I think train robberies in the Old West, especially the waning days of the Old West around this time, I think of Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and the Pinkertons. Were the
Mhm.
Pinkertons ever called for these fellas? The
Oh,
Pinkertons were a famous detective agency.
yeah, I don't recall seeing the Pinkertons in that story. The Southern Pacific um, uh, investigators, what's the word I'm looking for?
Yeah.
Southern Pacific detectives were involved in them. That's who Will Smith was, I believe. Because if you go onto YouTube and you click on Stories of the Wild West, you can find a short video, black and white, that
Mm-hmm.
tells the story of Evans and Sontag, and it has Will Smith and, of course, his love interest and all this stuff. But it basically uses their name. It doesn't really tell the actual story because in the end, Chris Evans surrenders and says, "I'll surrender. Will she stop shooting?" Because Eva runs out between the shooters and the bad guys and, "Oh, stop, father. Oh, stop. I will surrender if you give the reward money to the old lady who lives here in the cabin. Okay, it's a deal." So it doesn't tell the story, but it is funny to watch.
All right, Steve. Well, if anybody has any other questions, you can go ahead and use the chat box. Or if you don't know how to use that, maybe you could raise your hand. We could try and unmute you. But the chat box down there, some of the questions came from our staff and some of them came from the people viewing. So I think if that's it, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. And your next presentation, Steve, what will that be on?
Well, we can do anything we want to do. Do you want to do Joaquin Murrieta and Three Finger Jack?
Okay.
We can do them. That's a quite a crazy story. And then we'll do Black Bart, the gentleman bandit, who robbed 26 stagecoaches and never used a loaded gun. It's just like, what? How did this happen?
All right. So thanks so much, everyone. I don't see any more questions coming in. Fantastic presentation, Steve.
Thank you
And
very
I look
much. Very kind.
forward to here soon, and we can chat about some of that personally. So great job, and thank you so much. And look for our next webcast, our next webinars. And also, we'd love to see you at the museum. Again, we open up tomorrow on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
One last thing I'd like to say real quickly is that all little boys want to make history, but we all can't, but we can at least all talk about history.
All right. Well said. Thank you, Steve. Thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you soon. Fantastic job.
Thank you. Bye-bye.